watch CNN, I watch Fox, I watch CBS, and in this case, there's a lot of things not being said.
It almost certainly is a recombination event that was laboratory driven.
This is just the essential nature of Chinese communism. Chinese communism is evil.
Every person it harms is directly attributable to the Chinese Communist Party.
Absolutely riveting. A new documentary released just last night, tracking down the origin of Wuhan coronavirus. You might have recognized one of those folks there, our friend Gordon Chang. The film was produced and broadcast by Epoch Times, which is a newspaper website, both published in the Chinese language and in English, and it has become my personal source of information for what's really going on in China. There's so much inaccuracies being reported by the Western media, either by accident or because they negligently rebroadcast without skepticism or corroboration propaganda from Chinese state media. The Epoch Times, on the other hand, has dissident sources within Communist China, and of course has great journalists outside of them. And I'm delighted to bring you right now an interview with the host, narrator, and lead investigative journalist behind this documentary. He joins us via Skype from Queens, New York, Joshua Philipp of Epoch Times. Joshua, what a pleasure to meet you.
Hey, real pleasure being here. Some interesting stuff to talk about.
That's for sure. You know, I recently came across a study by two scholars, two academics in Wuhan, who published a paper that was then deleted, claiming that the virus was spread in Wuhan not from a bat in the seafood market, but rather from the virus labs that the Communist Party has in Wuhan. I found that compelling. Your documentary goes a little bit further. Why don't you tell us the thesis of your documentary? And by the way, we've embedded it on our website. People can watch it in full. Go ahead, Joshua.
Right. So, of course, we all heard the narrative that this virus started in this Wuhan seafood market, this wet market. That narrative, that entire narrative is dead. The Chinese Communist Party lied to the world when they told them that. Patient zero, at least the known one, had no connection whatsoever to that seafood market. The Chinese Communist Party itself has stopped using that narrative. And somehow the whole world has just been satisfied, at least at the government level, it seems, has just been satisfied at being lied to, with not knowing what the origin was or what the intermediary species was, if there even was one. And so the question is, where did the virus come from? And I think all of us want to know that right now. Now, we've all heard tons of information. I think not just me, but I assume everyone watching. You know, we're getting bombarded with information. And so how do you sift through all that? How do you go and track the origin of these different stories coming out? And what do they tell us when you put them all together? That was the goal of this documentary, to basically do a full picture of all the credible information we've seen come out of China on this. Look at the real information, the stuff that was deleted by the Chinese Communist Party. Look at what whistleblowers in China were saying about the real origin of this virus. And yeah, as you mentioned, out of that Wuhan lab itself, there were at least 2 whistleblowers who used their real names and came out publicly and said this virus came from our laboratory. And somehow that never really got much attention outside of China.
Yeah. I mean, this Wuhan virus lab has been in the news before. Bizarrely, Canada approved the transfer of the Ebola virus from our research lab to China last year, which is crazy to me. And then there was a startling case of a Chinese national and her students who were frog-marched out of Canada's top virus lab in suspicious circumstances by our mounted police. No charges were ever laid. There was not a full disclosure of what happened. But that Wuhan virus lab has been in the news in Canada. And I have to tell you, when I heard of this Wuhan virus, I thought, what are the odds? What is the sheer statistical likelihood that there was a natural, organic starting of a virus in the same city of this virus lab without the connection? I mean, it's almost ridiculous to believe there wasn't an involvement. Tell us a little bit more about your positive evidence that there was a connection.
Right, so let's look at this. Now, that Wuhan lab, the P4 laboratory, is about 20 miles up the street from that marketplace. When the Chinese Communist Party declared that the virus came from the marketplace, what do? They go in there and they destroy the evidence. They go and destroy the crime scene. Now, if this was a murder mystery and you had a dead body on the ground and there's blood and there's bullets, they went in, they got rid of the body, they got rid of the blood, they got rid of the bullets, they wiped down all the fingerprints. There's no possible way for the international community to go in now and either prove or disprove that narrative.
So you're speaking about the seafood market itself.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party destroyed the evidence with that, right? And so, again, now they looked into it. Patient zero had no connection to the marketplace. The question then comes up, well, what was the origin? Well, it just so happens that laboratory 20 miles up the road from this place, first off, yeah, they were started to study the SARS virus around 2003, 2002, when they were first announced. The head of that laboratory was one of the top coronavirus, bat coronavirus researchers in the world. She had been writing papers about this, Dr. Shi. She had been writing papers about this going back years. In fact, one of the papers in 2015 described it was a synthetic virus that it was shown to destroy the lungs of mice that had no known cure. The symptoms of that, the nature of that, very closely fit the description of this current virus we're seeing now. In addition to that, they talked about how to make bat coronaviruses transmittable to humans. That laboratory was on the frontier of this type of research on how do you change the key, right? The key that allows these viruses to connect to human cells. That laboratory was it was the frontier laboratory doing that kind of research. They had the SARS virus, they had these bat coronaviruses. It just so happens now that this new coronavirus, this Wuhan virus, or CCP virus as we've been calling it, if you look at the actual virus sequence, what does it show us? Well, it has a very close match to a bat from, I believe it's Nanjing province. Two different parts of it. One's over an 80% match. The other is a 100% match to the different proteins. Now, that bat coronavirus just so happens to have been submitted to the coronavirus database by the Chinese military, the PLA. In other words, a PLA bat coronavirus is the closest match to this one, at least the virus shell, the outer part of it. Now, these bat coronaviruses are not naturally transmittable to humans. And so what makes it transmittable? It's those little spike proteins, the little mushroom-looking things coming off the virus. It just so happens that the one circulating now, appears to come from the SARS virus, which is why they're calling it, SARS-like virus, right? And so this bat coronavirus is somehow a recombination, it appears, between this virus that was submitted by the Chinese military to this coronavirus database, combined, recombinated, not mutated, it appears, with the SARS virus. So how did the SARS virus join with the bat coronavirus? Just so happens that P4 Laboratory was doing research on this. They wrote papers on this. This is the kind of stuff they were doing there. And the fact of the matter that, a virus gets out that just perfectly fits the template of exactly what they were publicly saying they were doing at that laboratory, spreads globally, even fits a description of what people feared would happen if some of the viruses they described got out. And somehow it's called conspiracy if you talk about it. At least has been until very recently. I think UK government now and some other countries are seriously looking into the possibility that it might be lab-derived. And I think this documentary really shows that.
Here, let's take a quick clip from the documentary that discusses exactly this recombination that you're referring to. Here, take a look.
After the Wuhan outbreak, Indian researchers compared the S protein sequence between 2019 nCoV and SARS. They discovered that 2019 NCOV had 4 new sequences inserted, all of which can be found in HIV sequences through a search on GenBank. Shi Zhengli discredited those observations, although she never denied the existence of the 4 inserted sequences. However, scientists probing GenBank found that there were only 3 viruses containing all sequences. The first is the HIV virus itself. The second is a bat coronavirus discovered by Shi. And the third is this new Wuhan coronavirus.
We're talking with Joshua Philipp. He's the narrator of this groundbreaking documentary published by Epoch Times. Joshua, I can understand why the Chinese government would be absolutely terrified of their role in this. It's bad enough that people are dying from a, quote, accident. But if this virus was engineered in their labs, if this was a military weapon that was either purposefully or more likely accidentally released, I mean, at least Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, it didn't explode on purpose. It wasn't designed as a bomb. It just was poorly engineered, and there was safety protocols that weren't followed. The cover-up was just to save face, but here it's not even just about saving face. This looks, and you mentioned the People's Liberation Army, this looks like it was a deliberate weaponization of a virus.
It could be. Now, when people talk about bioweapons, they, of course, point to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is a signatory in the Bioweapons Act. They have agreed to not develop bioweapons. But even just, I think, 2018, 2019, the State Department had a paper talking about this. The Chinese Communist Party, we knew for a fact they had bioweapons programs going back decades. When they signed onto that program, they never even acknowledged the programs that we knew they had, let alone showed any evidence they got rid of those programs. The State Department was calling out the Chinese Communist Party even very recently, publicly, before this whole virus came out, about this, noting even that a lot of the lab research they have appears to be dual use. In other words, for both civilian purposes and for military purposes. A lot of what they're doing could be used for weaponization. Now, when you're talking about bioweapons programs, let's be clear about this. Countries around the world can talk all they want about how they don't have biowarfare programs. You know what they call them? They call them defensive programs. Defensive programs are weapon programs. And so they can run any experiments they want under the guise of defensive programs. And when in reality, they can be used for weaponization. Chinese Communist Party does it. Many developed countries do it. When it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, though, they've actually been very upfront, very public about the nature of their interest in these types of weapons. They have, for example, the unrestricted warfare doctrine. They've had Chinese generals come out and talk about how they need to develop multiple bioweapons for use against the United States specifically. The logic behind that is nuclear weapons, in other words, mass extermination of nations, is mutually assured destruction. It's not applicable, it's not practical if you want to actually destroy another nation. So what do they suggest? They suggest bioweapons. They've talked about this publicly. They've had papers on this publicly. And somehow I think that a lot of the academic, let's say, community, they tend to write off a lot of what these Chinese generals say because it's so extreme, because it's so aggressively hostile and violent and horrific that they have trouble believing it. But the Chinese Communist Party has never tried hiding the fact that it does this, never tried hiding the fact that this is part of their military doctrine and military program. And it just so happens, that now that there is appears to be a very destructive virus that may have come from a Chinese laboratory, at least the evidence does suggest this, may have connections to the Chinese military. We know for a fact that the head of China's biowarfare programs took control of this laboratory after this whole thing came out. That laboratory is now under the control of the PLA's top biowarfare person. And also during the building of the laboratory, a PLA-connected industry took over the construction. Of course, they were working with France earlier on. And when it comes to possible intentional, sorry, I'm in New York. You'd be amazed how many ambulances we have driving around here. But when we talk about possible leaks and possible intention to it, we've shown the documentary some interesting information. We look into the actual leadership of this laboratory, and guess who we trace it to? The sons of Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin was 2 leaders ago. He was the head of the Chinese Communist Party 2 leaders ago. It was Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, now Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin runs a rival faction to the current leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. His faction is really probably just as bad, if not worse, than Xi's faction. And they've been, at each other's throats. Xi Jinping's whole anti-corruption campaign was purging a lot of people connected to the Jiang faction. Just so happens now this lab is tied to the Jiang faction, specifically to Jiang Zemin's son. And it just so happens, too, that guess who runs a lot of the medical institutions in China, including the one that controls this Western drug that was given to China to treat this virus, this remdesivir, I can't pronounce it. Just so happens to be Jiang Zemin's son. In other words, the guy who's connected to that laboratory also runs the institutions that control the possible cure for it. And so, there's very strong possibility in this.
Let's show a quick clip of the movie in this regard. Here, take a look.
The Wuhan P4 laboratory was a subsidiary of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is managed by China Academy of Sciences. The director of the laboratory was Yuan Shiming, who was also the head of Chinese Academy of Sciences Wuhan chapter. Design and funding for construction were the responsibilities of the ex-vice presidents of the academy, Jiang Mianheng from 1999 to 2011, and Chen Zhu from 2000 to 2007. Jiang Mianheng was the eldest son of ex-CCP leader Jiang Zemin. After Jiang Zemin ascended to power after the Tiananmen Square massacre, his son entered the academy and led the Institute of High Technologies Research and Development. Jiang Mianheng created the Shanghai Institute of Life Sciences, and together with China Academy of Sciences, Shanghai colleges and universities, Shanghai hospitals, military hospitals, and research institutions, formed a profit group of life sciences organizations. They controlled China's major life sciences research projects and allocation of massive funding. Jiang Jicheng, son of Jiang Mianheng, is the controlling shareholder of Wuxi Aptec, which in turn is controlling Fosun Pharmaceutical, China's agent for remdesivir. Effectively, Jiang Jicheng is the kingpin behind the specific medicine for the outbreak. Meanwhile, Chen Zhu is the current president of the Red Cross Society of China, which had faced numerous scandals since the outbreak.
We're talking with Joshua Philipp, the host and narrator of this blockbuster documentary. Joshua, one of the excuses used by Western political leaders for being unprepared for this virus sounds legitimate enough to me. I mean, Taiwan wasn't fooled. I think they know to distrust anything said by China or the World Health Organization. But other leaders, including here in Canada, said, well, the World Health Organization told us it wasn't that big a risk, it wasn't transmissible. The Chinese government has said only a few thousand people have died out of a mighty country of 1.4 billion. What do you think the actual death count in China is? Because I find it hard to believe that it was as low as they say. I find it hard to credit them when they say there are no more domestic cases. It's all foreigners coming to China. Using your sources, what do you estimate the real number of Chinese fatalities is?
I'd say it's easily in the millions. Easily in the millions. Now,
so
one piece of evidence. Go ahead, sorry.
A terrible backfire in their own country. Like I mentioned Chernobyl before. The death count from Chernobyl was nowhere this high. I mean, it was a great disruption, great economic disruption. It was a great moment of truth for the communist regime. But millions of people did not die from Chernobyl. And yet Gorbachev said it was probably the central factor for the fall of the Soviet Union. Millions dying in China. How would we be able to corroborate that? How would we be able to learn or know that?
So Epoch Times, we've been making a lot of phone calls into China. We also have a lot of sources on the ground in China. We're blacklisted in China, proudly blacklisted, because that means we're telling the truth about them. And of course, you tell the truth, kick you out. We actually did have an office in China early on. They arrested everyone. Our editor spent 10 years in prison, and they tortured him. That's what happens when you tell the truth in China. And so when it comes to this, of course, we've made phone calls into some of the funeral homes, into the cremation centers. They told us they were working 24/7. And even then, they did not have the capacity to cremate all the bodies. The Chinese Communist Party brought in mobile incinerators into the city. They said it was for other materials. They didn't say it was for bodies. We know that in Iran, the Iranian government is being accused of covering up as well. There was a report in the Atlantic that estimated the number of infections in Iran could be 2 million. There were other reports showing you can see the mass graves from space. There were so many of them. And Iran right now is calling out the Chinese Communist Party for lying to them about the lethality of this virus. Even Iran, which is a close ally of China, is calling them out for this.
Now, when it comes to the virus itself, I saw an early commentator, it was speculation, but I want to bounce it off you, who was looking at the demographics of who dies from this virus, and it's typically older men. And there may be some other demographic or ethnic characteristics to it. I mean, I don't know. And a theory that was bruited, again, this was pure speculation, was that China itself might have a diabolical idea of culling its non-productive senior citizens from the country. I mean, I thought that was an outlandish thing when I heard it, that China would actually want this virus to euthanize its old and unproductive population. I don't think there was any basis for that other than observation of who this virus kills. Do you think there's anything special about how this virus works that was deliberate, or was this just a pure attempt to weaponize a virus, and its manifestations are just random?
It's possible. I wouldn't put it beyond the Chinese Communist Party, let's put it that way. When you're talking about targeting with bioweapons, development of bioweapons, they can do that. That's one of the reasons why biometrics can be such an issue. You can target viruses in terms of bioweapons at specific, say, races, specific traits of genes. If you remember, the U.S. military actually warned, there was a warning going out to U.S. military personnel to not use these different genealogy programs, because the genealogy analysis of DNA is being sent to these Chinese labs. Now, why would the military warn personnel to not do these things? Because the DNA is being processed in China. I mean, you know, it's, who knows? Speculation. But that came out, I think, last year. And so, I mean, yeah, you can do that type of work. You can alter a virus to target specific types of DNA, specific types of individuals, even races. You can do that.
So you're saying that 23andMe, like when people take a sample of their saliva and send it to 23andMe or others like it, those are actually processed in China?
I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which companies, but yes, a lot of them do process DNA in China. Allegedly, when they do it, they don't include the name of the individual. But yes, a lot of them process it in Chinese labs.
Yeah, that's shocking. Well, how's this going to end? I mean, will it ever end? I guess there's two parts to that question. One is the health question, but the other is politically. I mean, we saw yesterday Donald Trump musing about getting out of the World Health Organization. I think that's very healthy. I see Taiwan has come out of this looking responsible and public-minded, and I really like how Taiwan is looking and how they're behaving. So I see some hope. But if China did misbehave in the way that your documentary suggests, do you see a larger realignment, a disconnecting of industry and security from China, a marginalization and maybe even a pariah status of China, akin to South Africa during apartheid era. Do you see the denormalization of China, or is their financial clout and military clout just too powerful?
I think we're already seeing this happening, that the United States appears to be pulling out a lot of companies from China. Companies are pulling out themselves from China because really they can't manufacture there right now. They're realizing now that China is a national security threat on many, many fronts. The Chinese Communist Party is hostile towards the West, towards the United States especially, that it will hold medical equipment essentially ransom unless foreign countries want to cooperate with it. France right now, for example, China is only saying they'll give them masks if they agree to install 5G from Huawei. And so, yes, the Chinese Communist Party is in a very bad state, and yes, Taiwan is in a very good state because Taiwan used to be recognized as the official government of China. They were the government in exile. The UN was the first to recognize the Chinese Communist Party as the government of China. The US unfortunately followed that. The Chinese Communist Party is a murderous regime. It is, under Mao Zedong alone, killed between 50 million and 70 million Chinese people. It is continuing to do these kinds of abuses. It's abuses against democracy activists, against, say, people who are critical of the regime, people who even spread online, rumors, as they call them, information about viruses like this, like they do with these doctors, citizen journalists, people who believe in religion, whether it be Muslims or Christians, Falun Gong or Tibetan Buddhists, brutally persecuted in China. I think the world needs to realize what the Chinese Communist Party is. It is not a system that is in any way friendly to us, and it is one that is extremely abusive to the Chinese people. And I believe this is exposing that in a way that, I never saw coming. I think everybody's starting to see now the nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, this is riveting. I want to tell our viewers that we will have a link to the full documentary below this video, and we've embedded it on our website as well. Joshua, I admire your work. Tell us where people can go to learn more. There's your website, Epoch Times. There's the newspaper that you publish in English. Tell us some of the places people can go if they want to go deeper on this, websites or other advice you have for our viewers.
You can go to theepochtimes.com, theepochtimes.com. You can also check out my show. It's Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. You can find us on the Epoch Times homepage or on YouTube. And that's probably the best places for you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Stay safe. This documentary certainly puts you were before, but you're definitely on the top 10 bad guys list for communist China. So stay safe because they are desperate now, and your documentary only adds to the pressure on them. Congratulations, and thank you for coming on our show today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, there you have it. Joshua Philipp from theepochtimes.com. We'll have the link below this video. Check out the full documentary. It's about 55 minutes. I promise you, you will learn more from that than from anything you've learned in the mainstream media, and you'll recognize friends of the show, including our friend Gordon Chang. That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.